The junior coordinator went dead silent on the line. I was sitting at my desk, overlooking the Annapolis harbor, holding a phone that had just informed me my wedding venue did not belong to me anymore. My mother had called the Chesapeake Bay estate the day before, crossed my name off a fully paid reservation, and handed my wedding date to my older sister. She told the venue I had graciously offered to step aside because my sister asked first. I had done no such thing. Welcome to Cutie Told Stories, where we tell the quiet stories of ordinary people setting boundaries that change everything. I am Elizabeth. Let me know your age in the comments if you have ever had a family member mistake your silence for weakness, and be sure to subscribe to hear how this ends. Let me tell you who I am before they try to rewrite my story too. I am 23 years old and I work as a marine insurance adjuster. I spend my days reading liability clauses and telling wealthy boat owners that a skipped inspection voids their coverage. It is an unsympathetic profession, but it taught me one vital rule. The only thing that matters in a dispute is whose name sits on the signature line. The entire theft unraveled at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. A local caterer called my office line to confirm the Oyster Raw Bar for our June 15th wedding. Then the caterer paused. She asked me to verify Victoria's request for the signature cocktail. I did not correct her. I let the silence hang over the line. Victoria is my sister. She is 26, engaged to a man named Preston, and she is the undisputed center of our family's gravitational pull. My fiancé Liam and I had spent 2 years eating pasta and skipping holidays to afford the $10,000 deposit on the Chesapeake Bay estate. It is a historic property with sweeping lawns and deep water docks. We secured it 14 months in advance. I thanked the caterer, hung up the phone, and dialed the estate's events office. A junior coordinator named Madison answered. I gave her my date and asked to verify the primary contact. Her keyboard clicked nervously. She told me the file had been amended. My mother Caroline had called to correct the reservation, leveraging her donor status with the local Maritime Society to bypass the standard protocols. She claimed Victoria needed a spring wedding, making it rightfully hers. My parents navigate Maryland society by acting as if their preferences carry the weight of municipal law. They did not ask me to compromise. They executed a hostile takeover of my asset behind my back, assuming I would simply absorb the loss to keep the peace. I did not call my mother to demand an explanation. I did not text Victoria to argue. Anger is a predictable emotion, and predictable people are very easy to manipulate. Instead, I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out a thick cream folder. Inside sat the original 12-page contract. I flipped past the floral restrictions and noise ordinances, stopping on page 8. The clause was clear. Transfers of the agreement are prohibited without the notarized written consent of the primary signatory. My name was the only one at the bottom of the final page. My bank account had cleared the deposit. They thought they could erase reality with a polite phone call and a donor check. They forgot I read the fine print for a living. I closed the folder, picked up my car keys, and walked out of the office to pay the estate's senior director a visit. The drive down to the Chesapeake Bay estate takes 20 minutes from my office in the harbor. I spent the entire route in silence, watching the sailboats glide past the Annapolis shoreline. The water looked like gray glass under the October sky, reflecting the sharp, cold reality of the afternoon. Most people would use this time to cry or call a best friend to vent about the betrayal. I used it to mentally review the liability statutes of Maryland contract law. Emotions are a luxury you can afford when you have a safety net. When your own family pulls the net out from under you, logic is the only thing that keeps you from hitting the ground. The estate sits at the end of a long gravel driveway lined with ancient oak trees. It is the kind of property that smells of old wealth floor wax and fresh hydrangeas. I parked my car, picked up my cream folder, and walked through the heavy wooden double doors. The lobby was quiet, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. A young woman at the reception desk offered a polite, practiced smile. I recognized her voice from the phone. Madison. I did not ask to speak with her. I requested an immediate meeting with the senior director of events. I kept my posture straight and my voice pitched to the exact frequency of a client who expects compliance. A few minutes later, a man in a tailored navy suit walked out to greet me. His name tag read David. He led me into a private office outfitted with a heavy mahogany desk and leather chairs. David folded his hands on the desk and offered a sympathetic nod, likely assuming I was a stressed bride having a logistical meltdown over floral arrangements. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened my folder and slid my original 12-page contract across the polished wood. I tapped my index finger on the signature line. I asked David to review the primary signatory. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the page, and then looked back at me, his sympathetic smile faltering. I explained that a junior coordinator had informed me my reservation was amended over a phone call initiated by my mother. I watched David's posture stiffen. I pointed out page 8, section 4, clause B. I recited the terms regarding unauthorized transfers. I then calmly outlined the legal implications of a corporate entity altering a financial contract without the notarized consent of the individual whose credit card processed the $10,000 deposit. I used phrases like breach of local commerce laws, financial liability, and corporate negligence. The color drained from David's face. He was an event director, not a lawyer, but he understood the threat of a lawsuit well enough to recognize a catastrophic administrative failure. He knew my parents were prominent members of the sailing enclave. He also knew that social influence offers zero protection in a civil court when a paper trail proves theft. He picked up his desk phone, dialed the front desk, and ordered Madison to bring him the physical file for June 15th immediately. When the file arrived, I watched him uncap his pen and draw a thick black line through Victoria's name. I instructed him to reinstate my name as the sole contact. Then I established a boundary they could not cross. I required a strict password protection protocol on the account. From this moment forward, any changes to the menu, the timeline, or the vendor list required a specific passcode that only I knew. Furthermore, I requested an email confirmation sent directly to my phone before I walked out the door, documenting the reinstatement. David typed frantically, desperate to mitigate the liability his staff had assumed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The venue was mine again. I walked out of the estate and got back into my car, but I did not turn the key. The venue was secured, but the arithmetic of the situation did not add up. A marine fraud adjuster learns to look past the initial incident to understand the motive. My parents have spent their entire lives curating an image of effortless prosperity. My father sits on the board of 3 different maritime charities. My mother hosts yacht club galas. Victoria is their crown jewel, groomed to marry into equal status. Preston, her fiancé, talks loudly about speculative investments, but he rarely reaches for the check at dinner. Victoria never wanted a June wedding. She hates the early summer humidity. For the past 6 months, Victoria had been planning a September wedding at an upscale boutique vineyard on the eastern shore. The vineyard was exclusive, requiring a deposit that rivaled the down payment on a modest house. Victoria had bragged about the wine pairings and the imported silk table runners at every Sunday dinner. Why would an image-obsessed bride abandon a luxury vineyard to steal her younger sister's waterfront estate? The theft was not just an act of entitlement, it was an act of desperation. People who have secure finances do not steal wedding venues, they simply buy a better one. I pulled my phone out of my purse and searched for the contact number of the boutique vineyard. I needed to know the exact shape of the lie my family was hiding. A woman named Claire answered the phone at the vineyard. I introduced myself using my professional title and explained that I was calling regarding the billing profile for Victoria's September event. I kept my tone administrative, implying I was a vendor attempting to reconcile an invoice for the bridal party. Claire sighed. The exhaustion in her voice told me everything before she even spoke the words. Claire informed me that the vineyard had officially released Victoria's date that morning. Victoria did not cancel the reservation because she found a better location. The venue canceled the reservation because Victoria defaulted on the payment schedule. The initial check had bounced. The subsequent wire transfer never arrived. The event manager had given my parents a 30-day grace period, assuming a prominent sailing family simply made an accounting error. The grace period expired on Monday. By Tuesday morning, the vineyard voided the contract. I sat in the driver's seat watching a flock of seagulls circle the docks as the truth clicked into place. The touted wealth was a mirage. My parents' assets are entirely tied up in maritime debt. The boat slips the regatta sponsorships, the waterfront property, all of it is heavily leveraged. They could not afford to pay for Victoria's luxury wedding. When the vineyard demanded the cash, the facade cracked. They needed a venue fast, and they needed one that did not require a new deposit. They looked at my life and saw a solution. They saw a June 15th date at a premium waterfront estate already funded by my hard work and Liam's savings. They decided Victoria deserved it more. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of family duty, that I would hand over my dream to protect their secret bankruptcy. They stole my venue because I had already paid for it. I lowered my phone. The air in the car felt very cold. The betrayal was no longer just an emotional wound. It was a calculated financial extraction. They were willing to sacrifice my wedding to finance their golden child's illusion of success. I started the engine and put the car into gear. I knew my mother would bring up the venue at our upcoming Sunday dinner, expecting me to play the role of the compliant, uninformed daughter. I decided to let her talk. I had the Chesapeake Bay estate back under my control, but a new idea was taking root in my mind. The boutique vineyard still had an open September date, and Victoria still thought she had my June venue. As I drove back toward the Annapolis harbor, I realized the most effective way to handle a thief is to let them think they got away with it. The drive down to the Chesapeake Bay estate takes 20 minutes from my office in the harbor. I spent the entire route in silence, watching the sailboats glide past the Annapolis shoreline. The water looked like gray glass under the October sky, reflecting the sharp, cold reality of the afternoon. Most people would use this time to cry or call a best friend to vent about the betrayal. I used it to mentally review the liability statutes of Maryland contract law. Emotions are a luxury you can afford when you have a safety net. When your own family pulls the net out from under you, logic is the only thing that keeps you from hitting the ground. The estate sits at the end of a long gravel driveway lined with ancient oak trees. It is the kind of property that smells of old wealth floor wax and fresh hydrangeas. I parked my car, picked up my cream folder, and walked through the heavy wooden double doors. The lobby was quiet, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. A young woman at the reception desk offered a polite, practiced smile. I recognized her voice from the phone, Madison. I did not ask to speak with her. I requested an immediate meeting with the senior director of events. I kept my posture straight and my voice pitched to the exact frequency of a client who expects compliance. A few minutes later, a man in a tailored navy suit walked out to greet me. His name tag read David. He led me into a private office outfitted with a heavy mahogany desk and leather chairs. David folded his hands on the desk and offered a sympathetic nod, likely assuming I was a stressed bride, having a logistical meltdown over floral arrangements. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened my folder and slid my original 12-page contract across the polished wood. I tapped my index finger on the signature line. I asked David to review the primary signatory. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the page, and then looked back at me, his sympathetic smile faltering. I explained that a junior coordinator had informed me my reservation was amended over a phone call initiated by my mother. I watched David's posture stiffen. I pointed out page 8, section 4, clause B. I recited the terms regarding unauthorized transfers. I then calmly outlined the legal implications of a corporate entity altering a financial contract without the notarized consent of the individual whose credit card processed the $10,000 deposit. I used phrases like breach of local commerce laws, financial liability, and corporate negligence. The color drained from David's face. He was an event director, not a lawyer, but he understood the threat of a lawsuit well enough to recognize a catastrophic administrative failure. He knew my parents were prominent members of the sailing enclave. He also knew that social influence offers zero protection in a civil court when a paper trail proves theft. He picked up his desk phone, dialed the front desk, and ordered Madison to bring him the physical file for June 15th immediately. When the file arrived, I watched him uncap his pen and draw a thick black line through Victoria's name. I instructed him to reinstate my name as the sole contact. Then I established a boundary they could not cross. I required a strict password protection protocol on the account. From this moment forward, any changes to the menu, the timeline, or the vendor list required a specific passcode that only I knew. Furthermore, I requested an email confirmation sent directly to my phone before I walked out the door, documenting the reinstatement. David typed frantically, desperate to mitigate the liability his staff had assumed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The venue was mine again. I walked out of the estate and got back into my car, but I did not turn the key. The venue was secured, but the arithmetic of the situation did not add up. A marine fraud adjuster learns to look past the initial incident to understand the motive. My parents have spent their entire lives curating an image of effortless prosperity. My father sits on the board of 3 different maritime charities. My mother hosts yacht club galas. Victoria is their crown jewel, groomed to marry into equal status. Preston, her fiancé, talks loudly about speculative investments, but he rarely reaches for the check at dinner. Victoria never wanted a June wedding. She hates the early summer humidity. For the past 6 months, Victoria had been planning a September wedding at an upscale boutique vineyard on the Eastern Shore. The vineyard was exclusive, requiring a deposit that rivaled the down payment on a modest house. Victoria had bragged about the wine pairings and the imported silk table runners at every Sunday dinner. Why would an image-obsessed bride abandon a luxury vineyard to steal her younger sister's waterfront estate? The theft was not just an act of entitlement, it was an act of desperation. People who have secure finances do not steal wedding venues, they simply buy a better one. I pulled my phone out of my purse and searched for the contact number of the boutique vineyard. I needed to know the exact shape of the lie my family was hiding. A woman named Claire answered the phone at the vineyard. I introduced myself using my professional title and explained that I was calling regarding the billing profile for Victoria's September event. I kept my tone administrative, implying I was a vendor attempting to reconcile an invoice for the bridal party. Claire sighed. The exhaustion in her voice told me everything before she even spoke the words. Claire informed me that the vineyard had officially released Victoria's date that morning. Victoria did not cancel the reservation because she found a better location. The venue canceled the reservation because Victoria defaulted on the payment schedule. The initial check had bounced. The subsequent wire transfer never arrived. The event manager had given my parents a 30-day grace period, assuming a prominent sailing family simply made an accounting error. The grace period expired on Monday. By Tuesday morning, the vineyard voided the contract. I sat in the driver's seat watching a flock of seagulls circle the docks as the truth clicked into place. The touted wealth was a mirage. My parents' assets are entirely tied up in maritime debt. The boat slips, the regatta sponsorships, the waterfront property, all of it is heavily leveraged. They could not afford to pay for Victoria's luxury wedding. When the vineyard demanded the cash, the facade cracked. They needed a venue fast, and they needed one that did not require a new deposit. They looked at my life and saw a solution. They saw a June 15th date at a premium waterfront estate already funded by my hard work and Liam's savings. They decided Victoria deserved it more. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of family duty, that I would hand over my dream to protect their secret bankruptcy. They stole my venue because I had already paid for it. I lowered my phone. The air in the car felt very cold. The betrayal was no longer just an emotional wound, it was a calculated financial extraction. They were willing to sacrifice my wedding to finance their golden child's illusion of success. I started the engine and put the car into gear. I knew my mother would bring up the venue at our upcoming Sunday dinner, expecting me to play the role of the compliant, uninformed daughter. I decided to let her talk. I had the Chesapeake Bay estate back under my control, but a new idea was taking root in my mind. The boutique vineyard still had an open September date, and Victoria still thought she had my June venue. As I drove back toward the Annapolis harbor, I realized the most effective way to handle a thief is to let them think they got away with it. My parents reside in a sprawling colonial situated in Eastport. The manicured lawn slopes directly down to the Severn River, ending at a private dock. Richard, my father, purchased the property 2 decades ago during a regional boom in commercial shipping. He spent the following years cementing his status at the local yacht club, ensuring everyone in Annapolis knew his name. Tonight, the circular driveway held my parents' imported SUVs and Preston's leased sports car. Liam walked beside me up the brick path. I had briefed him on the venue situation, the fraudulent transfer, and the voided vineyard contract. Liam comes from an old, understated tier of Chesapeake wealth. His family views public conflict as a terminal lack of class. He squeezed my hand, offering a silent promise to follow my lead and let the evening unfold. I lifted the brass knocker and let it fall. Caroline opened the door wearing a silk blouse and her signature pearl necklace. She kissed the air near my cheek, presenting the image of a delighted hostess. She guided us into the formal dining room, where the table was already set with wedding china and crystal water goblets. Victoria sat next to Preston. Preston wore a pastel polo shirt and scrolled through emails on his phone, oblivious to the undercurrents of the room. Victoria adjusted her posture, making sure the chandelier light caught her engagement ring. Liam and I took our seats across from them. The evening began with idle conversation about sailing conditions and local regattas. I ate my salad and waited for the inevitable pivot. A marine insurance adjuster knows that people committing fraud always try to bury the lie beneath a mountain of casual conversation. They think a relaxed environment will soften the blow of a contract violation. Caroline waited until the housekeeper cleared the salad plates and served the Maryland crab cakes. She took a sip of Chardonnay and smiled at me across the table and delivered the news. "Elizabeth, darling," Caroline began, her tone dripping with manufactured warmth, "we have finalized a slight change of plans regarding the wedding schedules. Victoria is going to take the June 15th date at the estate." She presented the theft as a minor logistical update, similar to changing a floral arrangement. She did not ask for my permission. She did not apologize for the inconvenience. She simply stated it as a finalized municipal fact. "Victoria really needs the spring lighting for her complexion," Caroline continued, cutting into her crab cake. "The autumn light on the eastern shore was just proving too harsh for the photographer she wants. And you are only 23. You and Liam have plenty of time to find another location. It makes the most sense for the family." Victoria leaned forward, adopting a weary, put-upon expression. "Honestly, Elizabeth, you are lucky to be starting over. Taking over your reservation has been incredibly stressful. The estate coordinator was so difficult on the phone yesterday, and your menu choices are so basic. I am going to have to overhaul the entire catering plan just to make it presentable for Preston's guests." I looked at my sister. She was complaining to me about the burden of stealing my fully paid wedding venue. She sat there draped in expensive clothing our parents could no longer afford, playing the victim of my inferior catering choices. A year ago, I might have cried. A month ago, I might have raised my voice and demanded an explanation. But standing in the estate office that afternoon had cured me of my emotional reflexes. I knew my name was the only one on the contract. I knew the venue had locked them out of the account. I knew their wealth was a hollow shell held together by maritime debt. I did not shout. I did not reveal that I had already reinstated my name and enacted a strict password protocol. I picked up my fork, I cut a small piece of crab cake, I chewed it slowly, swallowed, and took a sip of water. I nodded, maintaining a facial expression of total unreadable neutrality. The silence stretched across the dining room. Caroline paused with her wineglass halfway to her mouth. Victoria frowned, unsure how to process my lack of resistance. They had prepared for a screaming match. They had readied their defensive arguments, expecting me to throw a tantrum they could dismiss as youthful immaturity. My stoicism short-circuited their entire strategy. Richard shifted uncomfortably at the head of the table. He is a man who solves uncomfortable situations by writing large checks. Right now, his checkbook was empty, and his youngest daughter was staring at him with cold, analytical precision. The eerie quiet unnerved him. He cleared his throat and asked Liam about his recent promotion, desperate to fill the vacuum my anger was supposed to occupy. Liam answered politely, never breaking the placid rhythm I had established. We moved on to dessert. The housekeeper brought out a lemon tart and poured coffee. I needed to gather intel regarding the boutique vineyard. I had to be certain the September date was legally untethered from Victoria before I made my next move. I set my spoon down and addressed my sister directly. "I am surprised you let the vineyard go," I said, keeping my voice mild and conversational. "You spent 6 months talking about the imported silk table runners. Was it difficult to break the contract?" Victoria scoffed, eager to prove she was the one in control of the narrative. "It was a relief. The vineyard management was impossible to work with. Their contract was draconian. They demanded payment schedules that were entirely unreasonable for a custom event. I told them we were walking away. I am so glad to be free of that place." I needed verbal confirmation of her legal forfeiture. "So you formally released the date?" I asked. "You signed the cancellation paperwork?" "Of course," Victoria replied, waving her hand dismissively. "I sent the final email on Monday. The date is open. They can try to sell it to someone else, but good luck finding a bride willing to deal with their rigid payment rules. The estate will be much better for us even if I have to fix your menu." I absorbed the information. She had formally defaulted and released the date in writing. The Vineyard event manager was free to book the September weekend to any client willing to supply a valid credit card. Victoria believed she was safely secured at the Chesapeake Bay estate, leaving her original venue discarded in her wake. I finished my coffee. I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. I looked at Caroline and thanked her for the meal. I stood up, signaling to Liam that the evening was over. "You are taking this very well, Elizabeth," Caroline said. Her voice wavered, betraying a flicker of uncertainty. "I knew you would understand." "I understand the situation perfectly," I replied. Richard stood up to walk us out. His face was pale. He studied my expression, searching for a crack in my composure. He found nothing. A claims adjuster never reveals their ruling until the paperwork is finalized. I said goodnight to my father and walked out the front door. The night air coming off the Severn River was crisp and cold. The gravel crunched under my shoes as Liam and I walked back to my car. Liam unlocked the doors, but I did not get in right away. I stood in the driveway, illuminated by the glow of the porch light, and pulled my phone out of my purse. I pulled up the contact number for the boutique vineyard on the eastern shore. I had the intel I needed. I had the legal leverage. I dialed the number, preparing to make a purchase that would trap my family in a logistical nightmare of their own design. The morning sun hit the surface of the Chesapeake Bay, turning the water into a sheet of brilliant copper as I drove my car over the bridge toward the eastern shore. I took a brief morning leave from the insurance firm. My inbox was full of pending liability claims, but securing my perimeter required my full attention. Growing up in a maritime household, my father always praised the virtues of plotting a clear course. He taught Victoria how to pose on the deck of his sailboat for yacht club newsletters. He taught me how to read the weather radar and secure the mooring lines. I learned early that the person tying the knots dictates what stays tethered and what drifts away. The boutique vineyard sat nestled at the end of a winding country road, surrounded by rows of turning grapevines. It was an exclusive property that catered to affluent clients. I parked near the tasting room and walked inside. The aesthetic was rustic wealth. Reclaimed wood beams spanned the ceiling, and the scent of crushed grapes filled the air. A woman with an exhausted expression stood behind the reception counter. I introduced myself and asked for Claire, the event manager I had spoken to on the phone the previous afternoon. Claire led me into a small back office. The strain of managing a high-volume hospitality venue showed around her eyes. A prime September weekend represents a significant portion of a vineyard's seasonal revenue. When a bride defaults mere weeks before the event, the venue absorbs a catastrophic loss. The food orders go unplaced, the staffing schedules collapse, and the dates are nearly impossible to resell on short notice. Claire sat across from me, bracing herself for whatever administrative headache I was bringing to her desk. I did not offer apologies on behalf of my family. I handed her my business card. I explained that I was aware Victoria had forfeited the upcoming September weekend due to non-payment. I kept my voice neutral, leaning into the professional cadence I used during settlement meetings. I told Claire I wanted to procure the date. Her posture shifted. A flicker of hope replaced the exhaustion. She pulled up the scheduling software on her computer, confirming the Friday and Saturday were open. She began reciting the standard pricing tiers for a full wedding package. I lifted my hand to pause the pitch. I clarified my intentions. I was not planning a wedding. I already held a secure contract for a June ceremony at the Chesapeake Bay estate. Instead, I wanted to reserve the vineyard for an extended rehearsal dinner and a welcome weekend for my out-of-town guests. Furthermore, I was not willing to pay the premium wedding rate for a distressed asset. In the marine insurance industry, when a vessel suffers localized damage, we calculate the salvage value. We determine what the remaining asset is worth and negotiate a settlement that mitigates a total loss for the underwriter. Claire was the underwriter, and Victoria's canceled wedding was the damaged vessel. I outlined a proposal. I offered to pay the venue in full, immediately, using a certified bank draft. In exchange, I required a steep discount on the site fee. I pointed out that a discounted revenue stream was vastly superior to an empty property. My welcome party would require catering, bar staff, and equipment rentals, providing the vineyard with guaranteed income they had written off just 24 hours prior. Claire reviewed my numbers. The arithmetic was undeniable. I was offering a financial lifeline wrapped in a watertight contract. She excused herself to consult with the property owner. 10 minutes later, she returned with a freshly printed agreement. We spent the next half hour adjusting the event parameters. We finalized a menu centered around local seafood and selected a tiered wine pairing. I read every line of the new contract, ensuring the cancellation policies and transfer clauses were locked down. I signed my name at the bottom of the final page. I handed Claire my payment card and the transaction processed. I walked out of the vineyard holding a sealed envelope containing my receipt. I paused by my car, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The landscape of the conflict had fundamentally shifted. I now legally controlled my original June date at the estate and Victoria's discarded September date at the vineyard. I held the keys to both properties. Victoria currently believes she had evicted me from my dream venue, but in reality, she held nothing. She was an unmoored boat, drifting toward a rocky shoreline. Over the next few weeks, the minor tension of the situation began to manifest in Victoria's profound blind confidence. Rather than verifying her paperwork with the Chesapeake Bay estate, she leaned into the performance of being a stressed, affluent bride. She focused on the aesthetics, leaving the logistics to assumption. I sat on my living room sofa one evening, scrolling through social media while Liam reviewed building blueprints at the kitchen island. My phone screen lit up with Victoria's latest post. She had uploaded a video showcasing her wedding invitations. They were spectacular. Thick cotton paper, gold foil stamping, and a custom wax seal bearing her and Preston's initials. The calligraphy spelled out, June 15th, Chesapeake Bay Estate. Liam walked over and looked over my shoulder at the screen. He shook his head, a quiet chuckle escaping his lips. Liam is a structural engineer. He builds bridges and evaluates load-bearing walls. He possesses a deep appreciation for foundations and a healthy disdain for people who build houses on sand. He asked me how much those invitations cost. I estimated a few $1,000s. They were already boxed and handed to the Postal Service, speeding toward hundreds of extended relatives, family friends, and yacht club dignitaries. I did not leave a comment. I did not report the post. I simply took a screenshot and saved it into a dedicated folder on my phone. A paper trail is only effective when you allow the opposing party to generate the evidence of their own deceit. The quiet satisfaction of holding the line sustained me through the rest of the month. I continued my daily routine at the insurance firm, evaluating claims and drafting denial letters. My relationship with my family settled into a Cold War masquerading as peace. We attended a few mandatory holiday gatherings. Caroline continued to drop subtle remarks about my need to find a new wedding location. Victoria complained about the difficulty of sourcing the correct shade of hydrangeas for the estate's ballroom. I nodded along, offering vague responses about keeping my options open. The charade demanded a high level of discipline, but the structure of the trap required patience. I knew the breaking point was approaching. A venue like the Chesapeake Bay Estate operates on strict logistical timelines. They require catering meetings, floor plan approvals, and tasting sessions months in advance. Victoria could not hide behind a fake reservation forever. The corporate machinery of the venue would eventually require her to interface with the actual account. The catalyst arrived on a Thursday morning. I was sitting at my desk drafting a liability report for a flooded engine room when my personal cell phone buzzed. The caller identification displayed the main office number for the Chesapeake Bay Estate. I answered the call, keeping my voice steady. It was David, the senior director of events. His tone was professional, but underneath the polished exterior, I detected a distinct note of urgency. He informed me that an issue had arisen regarding my account. 10 minutes prior, Victoria had called the estate's main line. She demanded to speak with the catering manager to schedule a private tasting menu for 6 people, citing the June 15th reservation. David explained that his staff followed the strict protocol I had established. When the junior coordinator requested the security passcode to access the file, Victoria became highly indignant. She insisted the passcode was unnecessary because she was the bride. She demanded immediate service, leveraging my mother's name and donor status. The staff refused to bypass the security wall. They placed Victoria on a brief hold and alerted David to the escalating situation. David was currently sitting in his office reviewing my ironclad contract and the specific notes prohibiting unauthorized access. He was calling to inform me that he was about to switch over to the holding line. He was preparing to formally notify Victoria that she possessed no legal claim to the June 15th date. He was about to tell her that her name did not exist in their system, that the reservation belonged exclusively to me, and that her requested tasting was denied. I thanked David for his adherence to the contract. I ended the call and set my phone down on my desk. I looked out the window at the Annapolis harbor, watching the boats bob against their moorings. The gold-foiled invitations had been delivered. The social media posts were public. The trap was springing shut. The fallout was imminent. The bomb detonated on a Tuesday afternoon. Victoria was standing on a velvet pedestal inside an exclusive bridal boutique in downtown Annapolis. The shop caters to a specific demographic of Maryland society, offering imported silk gowns and complimentary flutes of sparkling wine to bridal parties. Victoria was surrounded by her 4 bridesmaids, admiring a custom lace veil, when her phone rang. She answered it, expecting a deferential catering manager ready to finalize her tasting menu. Instead, she found David on the other end of the line. I was not in the room to witness the conversation, but in a town like Annapolis, the details of a public meltdown travel faster than the tide. David maintained his professional composure. He informed Victoria that she was not listed on the June 15th reservation. He explained that the primary signatory had invoked a strict security protocol, locking the file behind a password she did not possess. When Victoria demanded he override the system, citing her status as the bride, David delivered the final blow. He formally notified her that her booking was voided. Her name held 0 legal weight, and she had no claim to the property. Victoria dropped her glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. The boutique fell silent. Bridesmaids stared as Victoria unraveled, screaming into the phone that the invitations were already mailed. She demanded to speak to the owner. She threatened lawsuits she could not afford. The sales attendants, accustomed to polite disagreements over hemlines, watched in stunned fascination. By the time Victoria stormed out of the boutique, leaving her bridesmaids to apologize and pay for the broken glass, the rumor mill was already churning. In a town built on reputation, a public humiliation is the one stain you cannot dry clean. Word reached my mother within the hour. Caroline operates under the assumption that any door can be unlocked if you press the right social lever. She immediately dialed the Chesapeake Bay estate, bypassing the junior staff and demanding David. She did not ask for clarification, she demanded compliance. She listed her charitable contributions, her decades of yacht club membership, and her influence over the local Maritime Preservation Society. She instructed David to fix the clerical error and restore Victoria to the schedule. David did not fold. He had a legally binding contract sitting on his mahogany desk, and he knew the liability of breaching it. He politely but firmly informed Caroline that donor status does not override state commerce laws. He stated that a charitable contribution cannot compel a corporate entity to commit contract fraud. He advised her that any further attempts to alter the document without my notarized consent would result in the estate severing all ties with the family. He hung up the phone, leaving Caroline staring at a deadline, realizing her social currency had just bounced. At 3:15, my personal cell phone began to vibrate across my office desk. I picked it up and watched the notifications stack against the screen. The texts arrived in rapid, frantic bursts. They were paragraph-long accusations from both of my parents. Caroline called me a saboteur. Richard demanded I call the estate immediately to fix my childish mistake. They painted Victoria as a fragile victim and me as a bitter, vindictive sibling trying to ruin a beautiful celebration. They demanded I explain myself. They demanded I fix the ruin I had caused. I sat back in my chair and read every word. A year prior, the sheer volume of their anger would have triggered a panic response. I would have drafted a dozen apologies trying to explain my side, desperate to make them understand the injustice of their theft. I would have negotiated against myself just to stop the conflict. But reading liability claims changes how you process an argument. You learn that explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you is a waste of oxygen. I did not type a single word in response. I opened my photo gallery and selected the image I had taken the day I secured the venue. It was a clear, high-resolution photograph of page 8 of the contract. The image displayed the transfer clause, the date, and my signature anchored at the bottom. I attached the photo to a group message containing my mother, my father, and my sister. I hit send. I put the phone on silent and placed it face down on my desk. I turned my attention back to a flooded engine room claim, leaving them to argue with a piece of paper. Across town, the reality of the situation was suffocating Victoria. The gold-foiled invitations were already in the postal system, traveling toward hundreds of guests. She had broadcasted a date and a location she did not own. The facade was crumbling, and she needed a solution before Preston or his affluent family discovered the discrepancy. She could not admit to her fiancé that she had tried to steal her sister's venue to cover up a financial shortfall. She needed a legitimate wedding location, and she needed it fast enough to pass off the sudden change as a sophisticated pivot rather than a desperate retreat. She decided to swallow her pride and reclaim her original plan. She assumed her previous venue, the boutique vineyard on the Eastern Shore, was still sitting empty. She reasoned that a property charging such a steep premium would struggle to fill a September weekend on such short notice. Victoria believed she could simply call the vineyard offer a superficial apology for the delayed payment and throw a rush fee at the problem to reinstate her reservation. She assumed Preston would cover the penalty if she framed it as an administrative misunderstanding. Victoria locked herself in her bedroom, ignoring the chaotic energy radiating from our parents downstairs, and dialed the vineyard. She navigated the automated menu and reached Claire, the event manager. Victoria bypassed pleasantries. She announced that she had reconsidered her timeline and was prepared to move forward with the September date. She offered to wire the initial deposit by the end of the business day, adding a promise of an extra gratuity for the inconvenience. Claire listened to the rapid, commanding pitch. Having dealt with the fallout of the defaulted payment just weeks prior, Claire felt no obligation to soften the blow. She maintained a flat, administrative tone. She informed Victoria that the grace period for the overdue deposit had expired on Monday. Victoria interrupted, insisting that she was ready to pay right now, today, in cash if necessary. Claire did not waver. She stated that the vineyard was a business, not a storage facility for indecisive brides. She explained that upon Victoria's formal default, the date was released back into the available inventory. Victoria demanded Claire lock it down again, her voice rising in pitch, the panic finally bleeding through her manufactured confidence. Then Claire delivered the second devastating blow of the afternoon. She informed Victoria that no amount of money could reinstate the reservation. The prime September weekend was no longer part of the available inventory. The date was officially sold, the contract was signed, and the funds had already cleared the vineyard's bank account. Victoria demanded to know what kind of client books a premium venue with only a few months to spare. She asked if there was any way to outbid the new reservation, assuming that money could untangle whatever knot she had created. Claire explained that the vineyard honors signed agreements and does not entertain bidding wars over secured dates. The new client held an ironclad contract, just as Victoria once did, and the venue intended to execute the event exactly as planned. The reality of her situation settled over Victoria like a heavy winter coat. She had thrown away a luxury vineyard because her parents were broke. She had attempted to hijack a historic estate because it was already funded. Now she held nothing. The invitations in the mail were worthless. The caterers, the florists, and the photographers she had lined up for June were tethered to a venue she could not enter. She gripped the phone, the silence of her bedroom pressing in on her. She asked Claire one final question, her voice dropping to a whisper, demanding to know the identity of the client who had taken her date. Claire did not hesitate. As a hospitality professional, she understood the value of transparency when a client attempted to force an impossible outcome. She checked her ledger, reading the name printed on the finalized contract. She informed Victoria that the September weekend had been secured by Elizabeth Delilah for a private maritime logistics networking event and a rehearsal dinner. The silence on the line stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. Victoria sat on her bedroom floor, the phone pressed against her ear, trying to process the arithmetic of the situation. Her younger sister had not just reclaimed her own property, she had quietly, methodically reached across the board and captured the only viable fallback option. Elizabeth now legally controlled the June date at the Chesapeake Bay estate and the September weekend at the Boutique Vineyard. She possessed the two most coveted waterfront properties in the region, while Victoria held nothing but a stack of mailed invitations pointing to a locked door. The Annapolis wedding market is notorious for its rigid booking windows. Securing a premium venue requires a lead time of at least a year. Victoria was boxed out. The realization struck her like a physical blow. She hung up the phone, her breathing shallow, and ran down the stairs to find our mother. Carolyn was sitting in the sunroom, nursing a cup of tea and reviewing a charity gala guest list. When Victoria relayed the news about the vineyard, the teacup rattled against its saucer. The illusion of their control evaporated in an instant. They had assumed my silence over the past few weeks indicated compliance. They mistook my lack of screaming for a lack of a spine. Now they understood I had spent that time building a financial fortress they could not breach. Carolyn could not fathom a world where a 23-year-old daughter outmaneuvered her. In her mind, authority belonged to the loudest voice in the room. She decided the only way to fix the catastrophe was to corner me in a space where I could not ignore her. She grabbed her purse, marched to her vehicle, and drove straight toward the harbor. My office building sits in the commercial district, featuring a glass facade and a lobby lined with polished slate. It is an environment engineered for quiet, high-stakes negotiations. I was reviewing a salvage report when the receptionist sent an urgent message through the internal chat system. My mother was downstairs, and she was refusing to wait in the designated seating area. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt, and walked toward the elevators. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I felt the cool, calculated focus of a claims adjuster walking into a settlement meeting. When the elevator doors parted, I saw Caroline standing near the reception desk, her posture rigid with indignation. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, looked deeply uncomfortable, her hands hovering over her keyboard. Caroline wore her signature cashmere cardigan, but her hair was slightly windblown, betraying her haste. She spotted me and immediately raised her voice, intending to use the public setting to humiliate me into submission. She pointed a manicured finger in my direction, declaring that I was behaving like a vindictive child and demanding I fix the mess I had created. Several colleagues paused near the coffee station, their eyes darting toward the commotion. A scene in a corporate lobby is designed to weaponize embarrassment. It only works if the target feels shame. I did not flinch. I walked directly up to her, keeping my expression neutral. I did not ask her to lower her voice. I reached into my blazer pocket and retrieved a folded piece of paper. It was a printed copy of the Vineyard deposit receipt bearing the official letterhead and a transaction confirmation code. I extended my hand and offered the document to her. Caroline stopped talking mid-sentence, her eyes dropping to the paper. She snatched it from my fingers and scanned the figures. The numerical reality of the paid invoice stared back at her, the black ink stark against the white paper. The lobby air conditioning hummed, filling the silence that stretched between us. I kept my voice low, ensuring only she could hear the words. I told her she had claimed Victoria needed a venue. I pointed out that Victoria already had one, but failed to fund it. I explained that I simply took what her golden child threw away, utilizing the exact same strategy they had attempted to use against me. The difference, I noted, was that my transaction was legally binding and fully funded. Caroline looked at the receipt, and then she looked at me. The color drained from her cheeks. She realized, perhaps for the first time in my life, that she could not bully me with volume. My boundaries were not built on emotional pleas. They were constructed with certified bank drafts and signed contracts. She could scream until her lungs gave out, but it would not alter the name on the deed or magically produce the funds they lacked. She crumpled the receipt in her fist, her jaw tight, unable to formulate a counter-argument that did not involve admitting her own financial insolvency. I turned around, walked back to the elevator, and pressed the button for my floor. I left her standing in the slate lobby, holding the evidence of her defeat. Caroline retreated to her SUV. She sat in the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel, staring at the glass facade of my office building. The logistical war was over. I had won the battle of contracts and deposits. She knew she could not retrieve the Chesapeake Bay estate, and she could not buy back the boutique vineyard. But my mother is a creature of high society, and when a socialite loses a tactical advantage, she pivots to the only battlefield she truly understands. If she could not control the venues, she would control the narrative. She pulled her phone from her purse and opened her social media applications. The elite Annapolis Yacht Club maintains a private, heavily vetted digital group. It serves as the central nervous system for local gossip, charity gala organizing, and reputation management. Caroline understood that whoever tells the story first usually dictates the truth. She needed to paint herself and Victoria as the innocent victims of an unprovoked attack. She began to type, her thumbs flying across the screen as she drafted a victim-playing manifesto. She crafted a post detailing the heartbreak of planning a wedding, emphasizing Victoria's delicate emotional state and the stress of managing a large guest list. She omitted the bounce checks, the attempted contract fraud, and the secret debt that catalyzed the entire ordeal. Instead, she spun a tale of a jealous younger sister who stole a backup venue out of petty spite, leaving a beautiful bride with nowhere to celebrate her upcoming union. She used words like sabotage, betrayal, and family tragedy. She layered the narrative with just enough maternal sorrow to evoke sympathy from the other wealthy matriarchs in the group. She reviewed the paragraphs, ensuring the tone struck the perfect balance of tragedy and grace, and pressed publish. The conflict had officially shifted from logistics to social warfare, setting the stage for a vicious smear campaign designed to isolate me from the community. She smiled at her screen, assuming I possessed no defense against a ruined reputation. Caroline's digital offensive launched at 8 o'clock in the evening. She utilized a private social media group restricted to the elite members of the Annapolis Yacht Club. It is a digital echo chamber where reputations are minted and destroyed between brunch plans. Her post was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. She spun a tragic narrative featuring Victoria as an innocent, stressed bride whose dream celebration was callously stolen. Caroline described me as an entitled, jealous sibling hoarding a backup venue out of spite. She typed paragraphs lamenting my supposed cruelty, claiming I had hijacked a luxury vineyard simply to watch my older sister suffer. She ended the diatribe with a plea for prayers, cementing her role as the heartbroken matriarch, trying to hold her fractured family together. The local rumor mill ignited instantly. By dawn, my phone was congested with incoming notifications. High society warfare is rarely direct. It thrives on plausible deniability. I received text messages layered with veiled hostility from distant aunts offering unsolicited advice on forgiveness. A woman who chairs the annual Maritime Charity Gala left a voicemail suggesting I seek spiritual counsel for my bridal behavior. Former high school acquaintances sent sad emojis asking if I was experiencing a mental health crisis. Caroline assumed the sheer volume of public shaming would crush my resolve. She expected me to surrender the dates to silence the whispers. She failed to realize that marine adjusters are immune to emotional extortion. I read the messages, turned off my notifications, and went to work. Caroline made one fatal strategic error. My parents operate in a loud, performative sphere of new money, constantly sponsoring regattas to ensure their names remain relevant. Liam comes from a vastly different ecosystem. His family represents the oldest, quietest tier of Chesapeake wealth. They do not buy influence. They own the infrastructure. Liam's mother, Catherine, sits on the board of the Historical Society. She views public drama as a terminal symptom of low class. When the Yacht Club Facebook group erupted with Caroline's tearful manifesto, Catherine did not leave a supportive comment. She did not engage with the digital circus. She bypassed the noise entirely and called my cell phone. Catherine invited me to her home for morning tea. Her property sits in an exclusive gated neighborhood shrouded by ancient willow trees. It is a house built on generations of quiet competence. I arrived carrying the cream folder that contained the architecture of my defense. Catherine poured Earl Grey into fine porcelain cups. She did not ask me if the rumors were true. She simply asked me to outline the logistical reality of the situation. I kept my posture relaxed and my voice even. I did not offer a defensive, tearful rebuttal. I opened the folder and placed the evidence on the glass table. I started with the original Chesapeake Bay estate contract, pointing to my signature and the cleared deposit receipt. Next, I provided the internal email from David, the events director, documenting my parents' unauthorized attempt to overwrite the reservation. Finally, I laid out the boutique vineyard paperwork, including the official ledger proving Victoria's financial default. I explained that I had legally purchased the discarded September date to host my welcome party. Catherine examined the documents with the sharp, discerning eye of a woman accustomed to managing extensive family trusts. She did not express outrage over the gossip. The gossip was irrelevant. Catherine was appalled by the tangible, documented fraud. In her circles, missing a payment is a quiet disgrace. Attempting to steal a family member's asset to cover the shortfall is an unforgivable breach of ethics. She traced her finger over the forged amendment note from the estate. She placed her teacup on its saucer, her expression hardening into a formidable mask. She assured me I did not need to defend myself online. She promised to handle the rumor mill. A quiet clarification from Catherine carried infinitely more weight than 100 frantic social media posts from Caroline. My perimeter was now guarded by the most influential woman in Annapolis. While my defenses solidified, Victoria's world was rapidly contracting. A new urgent timeline began to tick down. Her fiancé Preston was starting to ask pointed questions. Preston builds his identity around startup capital and luxury branding. He is eager to impress his wealthy investors, but he is notoriously disorganized, relying entirely on Victoria to manage their social calendar. He had seen the expensive gold-foiled invitations advertising the June 15th date at the estate. He assumed the logistics were flawless. Now the discrepancies were becoming impossible to ignore. Preston asked Victoria why the estate coordinator refused to return his calls regarding their custom lighting installation. He inquired about the sudden pivot away from the boutique vineyard they had toured in the spring. Victoria spun a frantic web of excuses. She blamed incompetent vendors, scheduling glitches, and administrative errors. The lies were stretching perilously thin. Preston was unaware of his future in-laws' hidden maritime debt. He assumed their lifestyle was backed by solid liquid capital. He expected a flawless high society wedding, and he was growing frustrated by the constant logistical hurdles. The pressure of maintaining the illusion pushed Victoria toward the edge of reason. She could not confess the truth to Preston. Admitting the financial ruin would destroy the image she had cultivated, and exposing her complicity in the theft would likely end the engagement. The ticking clock of the wedding timeline echoed louder with each passing day. Premium vendors require final headcount numbers, menu selections, and logistical walkthroughs months in advance. She needed access to a venue, but more importantly, she needed a scapegoat. She needed my event to collapse so she could swoop in, reclaim the June date, and convince Preston she had salvaged the celebration from an incompetent event planner. Victoria realized she could not bypass the physical security wall at the Chesapeake Bay estate. David and his staff were on high alert, armed with my password protocol. If she could not steal the physical property, she decided to dismantle my wedding from the inside out. She reasoned that if my florists, photographers, and caterers suddenly canceled their contracts, my wedding would implode, leaving the venue wide open for her to claim. She sat in her childhood bedroom, staring at her laptop screen, gathering the business cards of the luxury vendors I had hired. She knew their names because she had spent months criticizing my choices during family dinners. She typed the URL for the catering portal into her browser. Her hands hovered over the keyboard as she prepared to commit a highly illegal act out of sheer desperation. The pressure on Victoria was no longer localized to her own anxiety. It had breached the perimeter of Preston's family. Preston's parents reside in a sprawling property in Potomac, and they are accustomed to a certain caliber of event execution. They had generously offered to cover the floral arrangements for the June 15th date. Naturally, Preston's mother requested the contact information for the florist to coordinate the table centerpieces. Victoria had to invent a series of delays, claiming the design team was finalizing a seasonal botanical overhaul and could not accept outside consultations yet. The excuses sounded thin even to Preston. He started asking why the catering contracts had not been forwarded for his review. He wondered aloud why the photographer had not sent the preliminary engagement shoot schedule. Victoria was cornered. She possessed the fake invitations, but she lacked the operational infrastructure to sustain the lie. She needed my vendors to suddenly become available, and she needed it to happen under the guise of my own administrative failure. At 2 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, my cell phone vibrated on the nightstand. The screen illuminated the dark bedroom, casting a pale glow across the ceiling. Liam shifted in his sleep, his breathing steady and undisturbed. I reached for the device, assuming it was an automated update from the maritime weather buoy system I monitor for work. It was an automated alert, but it had nothing to do with the Chesapeake tides. The notification originated from my secure event portal. A second alert followed immediately from the catering company's client dashboard. Then a third arrived from the photography studio's login page. Someone was actively attempting to reset my administrative passwords. I sat up and leaned against the headboard. I opened the alerts. The unauthorized user was submitting password recovery requests using my primary email address. They were attempting to bypass the authentication barrier by guessing my security questions. The prompts were standard: mother's maiden name, first childhood pet, the street where I grew up. Victoria knew the answers to all of them. An uninformed bride might have frantically changed her passwords, locked the accounts, and sent a furious text message demanding the intrusion stop. But I adjust marine fraud claims. I know that interrupting an offense in progress merely teaches the perpetrator to be more careful the next time. If you want definitive proof, you let them leave their digital fingerprints on the glass. I had anticipated an escalation the moment I secured the venues. 2 weeks prior, I enlisted the help of a colleague named Marcus. Marcus works in the digital forensics department at my insurance firm, tracing offshore wire transfers and identifying fraudulent salvage claims. He treats network security with the reverence most people reserve for religion. When I explained my family dynamic, Marcus helped me reinforce my digital perimeter. We updated my vendor portals with two-factor authentication protocols that routed directly to a secure application on my phone. We also altered the answers to my security questions, replacing factual data with alphanumeric sequences no sibling could ever guess. Most importantly, Marcus installed a tracking script on my personal event website, which served as the central hub linking all my vendor portals. Any login attempt generated a detailed diagnostic report capturing the device identifier, the browser type, and the IP address of the user. I swung my legs out of bed, walked into the kitchen, and opened my laptop. I poured a glass of cold water and watched the intrusion unfold in real time. Victoria was persistent. The logs showed her failing the security question prompt on the catering site, then pivoting to the florist's portal. She tried variations of my childhood dog's name, adding numbers and special characters, growing increasingly erratic with each locked screen. Her objective was transparent. If she could access the accounts, she intended to cancel the contracts in my name, releasing the vendors back into the open market so she could immediately rebook them under her own. I watched the cursor blink as the diagnostic script compiled the data. I did not block her access. I let her try. I let her fail the prompts over and over, allowing the system to log every single unauthorized request. Each attempt transformed a petty family dispute into a documented instance of cyber harassment. Attempting to access financial contracts using another person's credentials crosses the threshold into identity theft. The digital trail she was weaving was not a mere breach of etiquette. It was a violation of state and federal statutes. After 45 minutes, the login attempts ceased. The system had locked the portals due to excessive failed entries, requiring direct verbal verification with the vendors to unlock them. Victoria had exhausted her avenues, achieving nothing but a permanent record of her desperation. I opened the diagnostic file Marcus had configured. The data was clean and irrefutable. The IP address mapped directly to a residential broadband provider. The geolocation coordinates pinned the origin of the signal to a specific address in Eastport. It was the exact longitude and latitude of my parents' waterfront colonial. The device signature identified a specific model of a premium laptop. I knew Victoria had purchased that exact model 6 months ago. I pressed print. the home office printer whirred to life, spitting out pages of time-stamped server logs, IP coordinates, and failed authentication records. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, organized them by vendor, and stapled the corners. I walked over to the dining table where my cream folder sat. I opened it and placed the digital logs on top of the Chesapeake estate contract and the boutique vineyard receipt. The folder was growing thick. It was no longer just a collection of event planning documents. It was a comprehensive dossier of financial deception and digital trespass. I closed the folder, turned off the kitchen light, and went back to sleep. I slept soundly, anchored by the certainty of my preparation. The silence from my family over the next few days felt distinctly different. It was not the silence of retreat. It was the quiet calibration of an approaching storm. My parents realized their social smear campaign had stalled, neutralized by Catherine's quiet influence. Victoria realized her digital break-in had failed, leaving her vendor problem unsolved. They were running out of lateral maneuvers, which meant they were preparing for a frontal assault. On a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the late-night login attempts, I returned to my apartment after work. Liam was standing in the kitchen, holding a rigid cardboard envelope. He handed it to me without a word. His expression was serious, devoid of his usual easy smile. The envelope was delivered by certified courier, requiring a signature upon receipt. The return address belonged to a prestigious law firm situated in the historic district of downtown Annapolis. The firm specializes in high-net-worth family disputes and reputation management. I broke the seal and extracted a multi-page document printed on heavy watermarked bond paper. It was a formal letter of demand drafted by an attorney named William Harmon, representing Richard and Caroline Delilah. I read the opening paragraphs. The legal jargon was designed to intimidate, filled with terms like tortious interference, intentional deprivation of assets, and actionable emotional distress. My father had hired a litigator to frighten me into compliance. The letter demanded I immediately relinquish control of the Chesapeake Bay estate and the boutique vineyard dates. It stipulated that I transfer all associated vendor contracts to Victoria within 48 hours. If I failed to comply, the firm threatened to file a civil lawsuit seeking punitive damages for the psychological harm I had allegedly inflicted upon my sister and the financial losses I had supposedly caused the family. The language was severe, structured to make a young woman believe her financial future was in jeopardy. They assumed the sight of a law firm letterhead would cause my boundaries to collapse. They expected me to call them in tears, begging for a settlement to avoid a lengthy court battle. They thought a piece of paper written by a hired suit would overwrite the truth. I laid the letter on the kitchen island, smoothing the crease in the heavy paper, preparing for the showdown they had just scheduled. I read the formal letter of demand a second time. I traced the embossed letterhead with my index finger. The document originated from a prestigious firm known for making quiet problems disappear for wealthy clients. The paragraphs were dense with legal posturing. Mr. Harmon accused me of intentional deprivation of assets and tortious interference with a vendor contract. He painted a picture of a calculating younger sister who had somehow usurped a legitimate reservation, causing severe psychological harm to an innocent bride. He detailed Victoria's supposed suffering, claiming she had endured public humiliation and acute emotional distress due to my actions. I sat at the kitchen island and let out a short, quiet laugh. The sound startled Liam, who was washing coffee mugs at the sink. He turned off the water, drying his hands on a towel, and watched me slide the pages across the granite countertop. In the marine insurance industry, intimidation is just another form of negotiation. I spend my work hours dismantling frivolous liability claims filed by boat owners trying to recoup losses on poorly maintained vessels. I review fraudulent sinking reports, exaggerated hull damage estimates, and fabricated mechanical failures. I know what a genuine threat looks like. A genuine threat relies on evidence. A bluff relies on volume and scary vocabulary. Mr. Harmon was attempting to bluff a claims adjuster using a narrative built entirely on quicksand. I read the third page again, focusing on the specific timeline Mr. Harmon had constructed. The narrative he presented was fascinating. According to the document, Victoria was the original primary signatory on the Chesapeake Bay estate contract, and I had supposedly manipulated the venue staff into transferring the deed into my name. It took me a moment to grasp the scale of the delusion. My father had not just hired a lawyer to frighten me. Richard had actively lied to his own legal counsel. He had presented a fabricated sequence of events, casting me as the thief and Victoria as the victim. He likely failed to mention my cleared credit card deposit or the forged amendment note. He had handed a respected litigator a loaded gun without disclosing that the barrel was plugged. The final paragraph contained the ultimatum. Mr. Harmon demanded I relinquish the unethically hoarded dates within 48 hours. If I refused, he threatened to initiate a civil suit for financial damages. However, the letter included a secondary option. In the spirit of familial reconciliation, Richard and Caroline requested my presence at a mediation meeting the following afternoon. The location was set for the Annapolis Yacht Club. The choice of venue was a strategic calculation. The Annapolis Yacht Club is the epicenter of my parents' social ecosystem. It is a space governed by strict decorum, polished mahogany, and quiet generational wealth. They chose a public, highly visible location for a reason. They intended to ambush me. They assumed that sitting across from a sharply dressed litigator in a room filled with their wealthy peers would strip away my defiance. They expected the weight of the environment to force my compliance, betting that I would rather sign over the venues than cause a scene in front of the local sailing elite. Liam read the letter over my shoulder, his jaw tightening with every paragraph. He is a structural engineer accustomed to building things that withstand immense pressure. When he encounters a failing system, his instinct is to reinforce it. He offered to attend the meeting with me. He wanted to sit by my side, provide a unified front, and act as a buffer against my parents' inevitable hostility. He argued that a mediation session involving hired legal counsel required backup. I appreciated his protective instinct, but I declined his offer. I explained my reasoning. Bringing my fiancé to the yacht club would validate their narrative. It would signal that I needed a chaperone to handle a legal dispute, reinforcing their belief that I was still the subordinate, manageable child they could force into submission. This conflict was born the moment they decided my time and my assets were expendable. I needed to finish it exactly as I started it. I needed to face them alone, armed only with the truth and the paper trail they had severely underestimated. Liam understood. He kissed my forehead, poured me a fresh cup of coffee, and told me to dismantle their argument. I spent the remainder of the evening organizing my evidence. A successful claims denial depends entirely on the chronological presentation of facts. I opened the thick cream folder on the dining table. I placed the original Chesapeake Bay estate contract on the bottom, ensuring the signature line and the cleared deposit receipt were facing up. Next, I added the internal communication logs from the venue, highlighting the unauthorized transfer request initiated by my mother. I layered the boutique vineyard documentation on top of that, clearly marking the date Victoria formally defaulted on her payment schedule. Finally, I placed the printed IP logs and the failed authentication records from my vendor portals at the very top of the stack. The folder was heavy, dense with irrefutable proof of financial deceit, contract fraud, and digital trespass. It was a comprehensive record of a family attempting to cannibalize their youngest daughter to protect an illusion. I closed the cover, smoothed the edges, and set it beside my purse. The following afternoon brought crisp autumn air and clear skies over the Maryland coastline. I left the insurance office early and drove toward the historic district. The Annapolis Yacht Club sits directly on the waterfront overlooking the harbor, where luxury sailboats and motor yachts bob in the gentle current. It is an imposing structure built on exclusivity and maritime tradition. When I was a child, my father used to bring me here on Sunday afternoons, attempting to shape me into the perfect sailing prodigy. He wanted a daughter who cared about regatta standings and social rankings, a mold I never fit. Victoria fit that mold perfectly, earning his favor and his unending financial sponsorship. I parked my car in the guest lot, turned off the engine, and took a slow, deep breath. I did not feel the familiar knot of anxiety that used to accompany family confrontations. I felt the cold, precise clarity of an adjuster walking into a final settlement review. I picked up the cream folder from the passenger seat. I stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing the lapels of my tailored blazer. I walked up the brick pathway leading to the main entrance. The afternoon sun reflected off the water, casting bright ripples across the exterior walls of the building. I reached out, grasped the polished brass handles of the heavy wooden doors, and pulled them open. I stepped into the foyer, clutching my folder, ready to face the lie they had constructed. The host greeted me by name at the front desk of the Annapolis Yacht Club. I followed him past the illuminated glass display cases housing silver regatta trophies and vintage nautical charts. The club stands as a monument to old money and carefully curated maritime heritage. The air inside smells of expensive lemonwood polish and crisp linen. Growing up, my father brought us here for Sunday brunch, parading Victoria through the crowded dining room while instructing me to sit up straight and keep quiet. He used this building as a stage to project his financial success and cement his social standing. It made perfect sense that he chose this exact location for his final performance. The host opened the heavy oak door to the Commodore room. It is a private dining space boasting floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the main marina. The afternoon sunlight hit the water, casting bright, shifting reflections across the ceiling. I stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind me. The scene was arranged with deliberate theatricality. My father sat at the head of a long mahogany conference table, his hands folded over a leather portfolio. Caroline sat to his right, wearing a crisp, tailored blazer and her signature pearl necklace. Her posture radiated an unwarranted, suffocating smugness. Victoria slouched in the chair next to our mother, inspecting her manicure with a bored, put-upon expression. A fourth person occupied the seat to my father's left. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, a silver silk tie, and a watch that likely cost more than my annual salary. His open briefcase rested on the empty chair beside him. This was William Harmon. He looked exactly like the type of bulldog litigator wealthy men hire to frighten their dependents into submission. He observed me with a practiced, evaluating gaze, measuring my youth and my simple work attire against his expensive tailoring. The entire room was thick with their shared confidence. They truly believed that bringing a lawyer to a private club would terrify a 23-year-old marine insurance adjuster into surrendering her assets. I did not wait for an invitation to sit. I walked to the opposite end of the table and took the chair facing my father. I placed my purse on the floor near my feet. I rested my hands on the polished wood. I did not offer a greeting or a polite smile. I let the silence stretch across the room, forcing them to initiate the dialogue they had so carefully rehearsed. Richard cleared his throat. He leaned forward, adopting the patronizing, authoritative tone he typically uses to negotiate boat slips and berate harbor masters. He did not ask how I was doing. He launched directly into a speech about duty. He spoke about what it means to carry our family name in a town like Annapolis, where reputation is currency. He framed my actions as a temporary lapse in judgment, a childish tantrum born out of sibling rivalry. He gestured toward Victoria, claiming my selfishness was causing her severe distress and ruining her delicate wedding timeline. He spoke for several minutes, weaving a narrative that painted him as a benevolent patriarch trying to restore order to a chaotic household. He argued that the Chesapeake Bay estate was the only logical venue for a wedding of Victoria's caliber. He insisted that holding the boutique vineyard hostage was a petty, spiteful maneuver, reflecting poorly on my character. He reminded me that Victoria's wedding was a crucial networking event for his maritime logistics business. Listening to him, I recognized the quiet desperation hiding beneath his booming voice. The slight tremor in his fingers gripping the portfolio betrayed his true motive. He needed me to sign over the venues because he was drowning in debt. He needed this free wedding to maintain his facade in front of his wealthy peers. When Richard finished his monologue, he nodded to the man in the charcoal suit. Mr. Harmon offered a tight, professional smile. He introduced himself, his voice smooth and practiced. He thanked me for attending the mediation, framing the ambush as a generous opportunity for family reconciliation. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of legal documents. He slid the papers across the smooth expanse of the mahogany table. They came to rest a few inches from my hands. Mr. Harmon explained the terms of the pre-drafted settlement agreement. He used a placating tone, treating me like a naive girl who had accidentally stumbled into a corporate boardroom. The demands were explicit. I was to sign a formal release transferring all rights to the June 15th date at the estate directly to Victoria. Furthermore, I was required to void the September contract at the vineyard, releasing the date back to the venue without requesting a refund. In exchange for my total surrender, my parents would graciously waive their right to pursue civil litigation against me for the emotional damages I had supposedly caused. Mr. Harmon tapped a silver pen against the table. He suggested that signing the document was the easiest way to avoid a lengthy, expensive court battle that would ruin my early career. He leaned back in his leather chair, folding his arms, waiting for the inevitable tears. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to pick up the pen, apologize to my father, and sign away my wedding, to escape the uncomfortable pressure of the room. Caroline smiled, taking a slow sip from her crystal water glass. Victoria finally looked up from her nails, a victorious smirk forming on her lips. They thought they had won. They thought the game was over. I did not look at the settlement agreement. I didn't look at my father, my mother, or my sister. I ignored my family entirely. I fixed my gaze solely on Mr. Harmon. I waited for a beat, letting the ambient noise of the marina outside filter through the glass windows. When I spoke, my voice was crisp, devoid of any emotional waver, pitched to the exact frequency of a professional rejecting a fraudulent insurance claim. I addressed him by his surname. I asked him if he was familiar with the Maryland statutes regarding commercial contract fraud and the unauthorized transfer of secured assets. Mr. Harmon blinked, his professional smile freezing in place. He clearly did not expect a young woman to respond to a legal threat with procedural terminology. I continued, keeping my tone conversational but razor sharp. I asked him a very specific question about his ethical obligations during client intake. I inquired if Richard and Caroline had disclosed the actual origin of the venue dispute before retaining his services. I asked if his clients had informed him that they impersonated me over the phone, attempting to forge an amendment to a contract funded entirely by my personal bank account. Mr. Harmon shifted in his chair. His posture lost its relaxed confidence. He glanced at my father, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. I did not give him time to recover. I asked him if he was aware that the boutique vineyard contract Victoria claimed I stole was actually voided by the venue due to severe financial default. I asked if he knew his clients had bounced a deposit check and ignored a 30-day grace period before I ever stepped foot on the property. The smugness vanished from the room. Caroline lowered her water glass, the crystal clinking sharply against the wood. Victoria sat up straight, her smirk replaced by a look of rising panic. Richard opened his mouth to interrupt, but the lawyer held up a hand to silence him. Mr. Harmon looked back at me, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the risk of my statements. An attorney builds a civil case on the facts provided by the client. If the client fabricates the foundation, the attorney risks severe professional embarrassment or participating in extortion. He asked me to clarify my accusations. He stated that his clients had provided a very different timeline of events. He warned me that making false claims in a mediation setting carried consequences. I nodded, acknowledging his warning. I told him I never make a claim without supporting documentation. A bluff relies on fear, but a denial relies on proof. I reached down to the floor beside my chair. I unclasped my leather bag and pulled out the thick cream folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany table, resting my hand on the sealed cover, preparing to dismantle their entire legal strategy, piece by piece. I opened the cream folder. The heavy cardstock cover settled flat against the mahogany surface. The private dining room grew so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us and the distant clatter of silverware from the main restaurant. Mr. Harmon watched my hands, his professional skepticism warring with a creeping realization that his clients had withheld crucial information. He expected me to offer tearful excuses. I offered him a chronological paper trail. I extracted the first stack of papers. It was the original 12-page agreement for the Chesapeake Bay estate. I slid the document across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of the attorney. I tapped my index finger on the final page, guiding his eyes to the primary signatory line. My name was the only one printed there in black ink. Next to the contract, I placed a certified printout from my personal bank account. The financial document highlighted a $10,000 transfer, matching the exact date and amount required by the venue to secure the reservation. I explained that in maritime insurance investigations, asset ownership is always dictated by the funding source. I pointed out that my parents had not contributed a single cent to the reservation. The venue belonged entirely to me, funded by my own labor. Mr. Harmon read the signature line, then reviewed the bank statement. His brow furrowed deeply. He looked up at my father, waiting for a legal rebuttal. Richard stared at the table, his jaw tight, offering no defense. I did not wait for the silence to stretch. I pulled out the second piece of evidence. It was a printed copy of the internal memo generated by David, the senior director of events at the estate. The text detailed the phone call initiated by my mother attempting to amend the reservation. The memo explicitly stated that the caller sought to overwrite the primary contact without providing the required notarized consent, utilizing donor status as leverage. I slid the paper next to the contract. I asked Mr. Harmon to review the venue corporate policy regarding unauthorized access. I noted that attempting to alter a funded financial agreement by impersonating the signatory or leveraging social influence constitutes fraud. I asked him if his clients had disclosed this specific administrative maneuver during their initial consultation. Mr. Harmon read the memo line by line. His posture grew rigid. A seasoned attorney relies on the factual integrity of his clients to build a viable case. He was currently reading documented proof that his clients had committed the exact offense they were accusing me of executing. The illusion of their victimhood was fraying, but I needed to sever their narrative entirely. I reached into the folder and produced the third set of papers. These were the financial documents procured from the boutique vineyard on the Eastern Shore. I laid the official cancellation ledger in front of the lawyer. The ledger contained the timeline of Victoria's booking, including the dates of her scheduled payment installments. Beside the ledger, I placed a copy of the notification detailing the bounce check and the ignored 30-day grace period. I explained the arithmetic to Mr. Harmon. I stated that Victoria did not lose her venue because I stole it. She lost her venue because she failed to pay her bills. I clarified that I purchased a discarded, defaulted asset directly from the vendor, operating well within my legal rights as a consumer in the open market. I watched the lawyer process the stark financial reality. The case he thought he was arguing involved an entitled younger sister stealing a wedding to cause pain. The reality involved an insolvent family attempting to steal a funded venue to cover up their hidden debt. The undeniable paper trail shattered the polished atmosphere of the Commodore room. The gaslighting collapsed under the weight of certified bank drafts and venue memos. Caroline saw the lawyer's expression harden and realized her social currency held zero value here. She resorted to the only tactic she had left. She began to cry. Her tears were sudden and highly theatrical. She reached across the table, her pearl necklace swaying, and pleaded with Mr. Harmon to ignore the paperwork. She claimed the documents were missing the human element. She insisted Victoria was suffering under immense psychological pressure and navigating a fragile mental state. She argued that family loyalty should not be measured by contracts and invoices. She tried to reframe the theft as an act of maternal love, a desperate attempt to protect an overwhelmed bride from public embarrassment. I cut off her performance by dropping the final stack of papers onto the table. The sound of the thick packet hitting the mahogany echoed sharply through the room. Caroline stopped crying instantly, her eyes darting to the new documents. I did not address her. I spoke directly to Mr. Harmon. I told him that emotional distress does not justify digital trespass. I slid the server logs and the diagnostic reports toward his open briefcase. I outlined the events that occurred at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. I explained that an unauthorized user attempted to breach my secure vendor portals by guessing my personal security questions. I guided his attention to the IP address printed on the first page of the report. I explained the geolocation coordinates mapped directly to the residential broadband provider registered to my parents' Eastport address. I pointed to the device signature identifying Victoria's specific laptop model. I kept my voice devoid of emotion, allowing the legal definitions to do the heavy lifting. I outlined the state statutes regarding unauthorized access to computer systems and the deliberate attempt to hijack financial agreements using stolen credentials. I explained that Victoria was not a fragile bride seeking a venue. She was an active participant in an organized effort to cancel my vendors and dismantle my event through identity theft. The room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Victoria sank lower into her chair, her face flushed with a mixture of panic and deep humiliation. Richard remained frozen, staring at the IP logs as if they were written in a foreign language. I looked Mr. Harmon in the eye. I asked him a very simple question. I asked if his firm's malpractice insurance covered the act of sending threatening legal demands on behalf of clients actively engaged in documented wire fraud and cyber harassment. Mr. Harmon did not answer me. He did not look at my father or my mother. The realization that he had been used as an intimidation tactic in a fraudulent family scheme radiated from him in waves of cold anger. He gathered the copies of the documents I had provided, aligning the edges with sharp, precise movements. He placed them inside his briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. He stood up, buttoned his charcoal suit jacket, and looked down at Richard. His voice was remarkably quiet, yet it carried the severe weight of a professional severing all ties. He informed my father that their attorney-client relationship was terminated, effective immediately. He stated that a final bill for his time would be mailed to their residence, and he strongly advised them against contacting his office ever again. Mr. Harmon turned on his heel, walked across the private dining room, and exited through the heavy oak door without looking back. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Mr. Harmon, sealing the Commodore room in a profound, suffocating silence. The sound of his leather dress shoes faded down the carpeted hallway, taking my father's legal shield with him. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, resting my hands near the cream folder that had just dismantled their entire strategy. The air conditioning hummed a low mechanical drone that only amplified the stillness in the private dining space. Richard stared at the empty chair where his expensive litigator had been sitting moments prior. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sallow shade. Caroline remained frozen, her posture rigid, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her linen napkin. They had walked into this yacht club expecting a swift surrender. They were now sitting in the wreckage of their own deceit, stripped of their social armor and abandoned by their counsel. The true climax of the afternoon had not yet arrived. A mediation relies on controlling the flow of information. I knew my parents would never voluntarily disclose their financial insolvency to their future son-in-law. They needed Preston's family wealth to maintain their status in Annapolis. I decided to provide the transparency they lacked. Early that morning, I had drafted a brief email to Preston. I did not include accusations or emotional pleas. I simply forwarded the calendar invitation for the mediation meeting at the yacht club, noting the time and the room number. I added a single sentence suggesting he might want to attend if he wished to hear the administrative truth regarding his upcoming wedding venues. The brass handle on the door turned. The hinges groaned softly as the heavy wood swung open. Preston stood in the threshold. He wore a navy blazer and crisp khaki trousers, the standard uniform of a Potomac Trust Fund heir who spends his weekends reviewing startup pitches. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly unsettled, bearing the expression of a man who had just watched a trusted business partner falsify a ledger. He had not just arrived, the door had not been fully latched, when Mr. Harmon stormed out, leaving a narrow gap. Preston had been standing in the hallway for several minutes. He had heard the final exchange. He had heard the recitation of the Boutique Vineyard default, the forged amendment attempt, and the forensic breakdown of the IP logs. Preston stepped into the private dining room. His gaze swept over the table, bypassing my parents and landing squarely on Victoria. For the duration of their engagement, Preston had viewed my sister as the ultimate prize. He believed he was marrying into a legacy, Annapolis sailing family, a union of old maritime heritage and new tech capital. He loved her curated perfection, the gold-foiled invitations, and the flawless narrative she spun. Standing in the doorway, that pristine illusion shattered into jagged pieces. He looked at the printed server logs resting on the table. He processed the arithmetic I had just laid out for the lawyer. He realized that the woman he was about to marry was not a stressed bride, victimized by a jealous sibling. She was an active participant in a fraudulent scheme. She had lost their luxury vineyard location because her family could not afford the deposit. She had then conspired to steal my funded reservation to hide the shortfall. When that failed, she had spent her night attempting to break into my digital vendor portals to hijack my caterers and florists. The deceit was structural, woven into the very fabric of their relationship. Preston's mind worked through the timeline. Just a few days prior, he had asked Victoria for the florist's contact information so his mother could coordinate the centerpieces. Victoria had spun a frantic tale about seasonal botanical overhauls and delayed consultations. He remembered asking about the catering contracts, only to be met with vague assurances that the paperwork was caught in administrative review. Hearing the server logs and the cyber trespass details confirmed every suspicion he had brushed aside. The delays were not administrative. They were the desperate stalling tactics of a woman who had no venue, no vendors, and no way out. Victoria noticed his presence and scrambled to salvage the situation. The confident smirk she had worn at the start of the meeting vanished. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She took a step toward the door, extending her hands, her voice taking on a desperate, pleading pitch. She called his name, attempting to deploy the charm she always used to smooth over awkward moments. She tried to frame the conversation he had just overheard as a misunderstanding, a complex legal dispute blown out of proportion by a vindictive sister. She promised she could explain everything once they were alone. Preston did not step forward to meet her. He took a deliberate step backward, creating physical distance between them. The gesture was subtle but devastating. He looked at her outstretched hands and then he looked at her face. The revulsion in his eyes was clear. In his world of venture capital and investor relations, you can excuse a bad market prediction, but you never excuse a deliberate misrepresentation of assets. Victoria had presented herself as a fully funded investment. She was actually a liability. He saw past the expensive silk dress and the salon blowout, recognizing the broke, manipulative fraud hiding underneath. Preston shook his head, refusing to let her close the distance. He instructed her to sit down. His voice lacked any of its usual loud, boisterous energy. It was flat and transactional. He turned his attention away from Victoria and focused directly on my father. Preston's family operates with a strict expectation of financial accountability. When Victoria first selected the boutique vineyard 6 months ago, Preston's parents had insisted on contributing to the celebration. They were eager to merge their Potomac influence with the Annapolis sailing elite. They did not pay the vendors directly. They had written a substantial clearing check made out to Richard, trusting my father to manage the venue deposits as the patriarch of the bride's family. Preston walked closer to the mahogany table, stopping just short of the scattered documents. He looked Richard in the eye, ignoring the tension radiating from my mother. He asked a question that shifted the entire landscape of the room. He stated that he had just heard me confirm the vineyard contract was voided due to non-payment. He recounted hearing the timeline of the bounced checks and the ignored grace periods. He then pointed out a glaring mathematical impossibility. Preston did not raise his voice, but the quiet intensity of his demand echoed louder than any shout. He specified the $50,000 wire transfer his father had authorized in early March. It was a sum meant to cover the exclusive site fee, the initial catering deposit, and the imported wine pairings Victoria had bragged about. He asked Richard where the money went. If the venue was never paid and the date was lost to default, those funds should still exist in a trust. Preston demanded a full accounting of his family's financial contribution. He watched Richard struggle to formulate a response. A man accustomed to navigating boardrooms and securing investor capital recognizes the physical tells of financial ruin. Richard's silence was an admission of guilt. Caroline looked toward the windows, unable to meet Preston's gaze, the pearl necklace suddenly looking like a heavy chain around her neck. The scope of the betrayal expanded far beyond a sibling rivalry. This was no longer a dispute over floral arrangements or spring lighting. It was a profound breach of trust involving a significant sum of money. My parents were backed against a wall they had built with their own deceit. The prestige of the yacht club, the mahogany table, the silver regatta trophies in the hall could not protect them from the cold, hard arithmetic of an audit. I remained seated, my posture relaxed, observing the exact moment my family's carefully curated empire began to burn to the ground. The silence in the Commodore room took on a physical weight. Preston stood near the doorway, waiting for an answer that Richard could not provide. My father has spent his entire adult life projecting the image of a seasoned maritime tycoon. He walks into rooms expecting respect, assuming his tailored suits and club memberships shield him from accountability. Now, confronted by a man who actually possessed the capital my father only pretended to have, the facade dissolved. Richard looked down at his hands, which rested flat against the polished mahogany. His knuckles were pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. Caroline attempted to bridge the gap. She possesses an uncanny ability to ignore reality, believing a well-placed compliment or a polite deflection can erase a deficit. She reached toward Preston, offering a strained, fragile smile. She suggested they sit down and discuss the wedding budget like sensible adults, framing the missing funds as a simple accounting oversight. She claimed the money was secure in a high-yield trust, waiting to be dispersed to the vendors. Preston did not look at her. His focus remained locked on Richard. The men in Preston's family do not build their fortunes by accepting vague assurances. They demand ledgers. They verify accounts. Preston informed my mother that his father had personally verified the wire transfer on March the 2nd. He stated the funds were deposited directly into Richard's primary commercial logistics account per Richard's specific request. Preston reiterated his question, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the severe tone of an investor who has uncovered a fraudulent prospectus. He asked my father one more time to explain why the boutique vineyard canceled a contract for non-payment when a $50,000 check had cleared 6 months ago. Richard finally lifted his head. The arrogance that usually defined his features had vanished, replaced by the hollow expression of a man facing his own ruin. He did not look at Preston. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the marina where dozens of luxury vessels swayed in the gentle current. My father confessed in a voice barely above a whisper. He admitted that his maritime shipping business had suffered catastrophic losses over the past 3 fiscal quarters. Several key contracts had fallen through, leaving him with an insurmountable pile of high-interest commercial loans. The debt had spiraled beyond his ability to manage the minimum payments. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on his commercial properties. More pressing to his fragile ego, the creditors were days away from seizing his prized 40-foot sailing yacht. The vessel is a fixture at the Annapolis Yacht Club, a floating billboard for his supposed prosperity. Having a bank chain the hull in front of his peers was a humiliation he could not endure. When Preston's family wired the wedding contribution, Richard did not place the funds in a trust. He did not pay the boutique vineyard. He diverted the entire sum to service his crushing debt. He used the $50,000 to quiet the creditors and stop the repossession of his yacht. He gambled that he could secure a new shipping contract in the spring, replenish the stolen funds, and pay the wedding vendors before anyone noticed the discrepancy. The new contract never materialized. The money was gone. The room remained perfectly still as the magnitude of the confession settled over the table. Embezzling funds from future in-laws to save a luxury boat is not a misunderstanding, it is theft. It shifts a family dispute into the realm of potential criminal fraud. Victoria made a fatal miscalculation. She could have played the victim. She could have claimed ignorance, acting just as shocked and betrayed as Preston. Instead, her instinct to protect her own interests overrode her common sense. She stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and attempted to justify the crime. She reached for Preston's arm, her voice pleading. She told him they were just borrowing the capital. She insisted her father was going to pay it back, claiming they just needed a little more time to secure the correct financing. She explained that this was the exact reason they needed my June date at the Chesapeake Bay estate. They needed a venue that was already fully funded to cover up the missing money until the business recovered. Preston pulled his arm away. He looked at his fiancée as if she were a stranger. Her desperate defense had just incriminated her. By using the word we, Victoria admitted she knew about the embezzlement. She had been fully aware that her father stole $50,000 from Preston's family. She knew the vineyard contract was voided due to her own financial default. Rather than telling the man she planned to marry the truth, she conspired with her parents to hijack my wedding. She was willing to destroy her sister's celebration to protect a felony. The revulsion on Preston's face was clinical. He is a man who values transparency and risk management above all else. He realized the woman standing in front of him was an unacceptable liability. He took a slow, deliberate breath. He unbuttoned his navy blazer and slipped it off his shoulders, folding it neatly over his arm. The gesture signaled a physical withdrawal from the environment. He reached into his trouser pocket and retrieved a small velvet box. Preston walked to the edge of the mahogany table. He did not toss the box. He placed it down with quiet, lethal precision. The engagement ring sat inside a symbol of a future he was permanently canceling. He looked at Victoria and stated that the wedding was off. He told her not to contact his family or his colleagues. He then turned his attention back to Richard. He promised my father that his family's forensic accountants would be in touch by the end of the week. He advised Richard to retain a defense attorney who specialized in wire fraud because the missing $50,000 would be pursued to the fullest extent of the law. Preston turned around and walked out of the Commodore room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The finality of his exit broke something fundamental inside my mother. Caroline did not rush to comfort Victoria. She did not mourn her daughter's broken heart. Caroline burst into genuine hysterical tears because she understood the social math of the situation. Preston's family would not keep quiet about stolen funds. The elite Potomac circles would communicate with the Annapolis Sailing Enclave. The story would spread verified by accountants and legal filings. Her yacht club memberships would be revoked. Her charity board seats would be vacated. The social status she had sacrificed her own children to maintain was evaporating before her eyes. She sobbed into her hands, grieving the loss of her pristine reputation. Victoria collapsed into her chair, staring blankly at the velvet box resting on the wood. Richard sat paralyzed, contemplating the impending audit and the inevitable loss of his business and his boat. They had built their lives on an illusion, and the truth had finally crushed them. I did not feel a sudden surge of triumph. I felt a profound, quiet relief. The ledger was finally balanced. I reached across the table and gathered my documents. I placed the Chesapeake Bay Estate contract, the vineyard receipt, the internal memos, and the server logs back into the cream folder. I aligned the edges of the paper closed, the heavy cover, and secured the clasp. I picked up my purse and stood up from my chair. My movement drew their attention. My father looked up at me, his eyes red and hollow. My mother stopped crying long enough to stare at the daughter she had deemed expendable. I looked at the three people who had tried to consume my life to fuel their own lies. I spoke in a calm, even tone. I told them that a wedding is a celebration for the people who support the foundation of a marriage. I informed them that they were no longer invited to attend my ceremony in June, nor were they welcome at my rehearsal dinner in September. I stated that my venue doors would be guarded, and any attempt to gain entry would be handled by security. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the ruins of their empire. I walked across the room, opened the door, and stepped out into the hallway. I navigated the polished corridors of the yacht club, walked out through the brass doors, and stepped into the bright, clean air of the Annapolis afternoon. The fallout from the Commodore room did not remain confined to the four walls of the yacht club. Annapolis is a town built on maritime commerce and whispered confidences. The elite sailing enclave operates like a small, interconnected ecosystem where reputation is the primary currency. Preston's family moved with the swift, unforgiving efficiency of corporate liquidators. By the following Tuesday, their forensic accountants had formally requested the transaction logs from my father's commercial shipping accounts. The mere presence of auditors in a wealthy neighborhood is enough to ignite fierce speculation, but Catherine Liam's mother ensured the narrative remained tethered to the empirical facts. She did not engage in loud gossip or post reactionary statements online. She utilized the quiet, devastating power of high society diplomacy. During a private luncheon at the Historical Society, a fellow board member referenced Caroline's earlier social media post offering manufactured sympathy for Victoria's supposed plight. Catherine simply placed her porcelain teacup on its saucer and corrected the public record. She detailed the forged amendment attempt at the historic estate, the bounced checks at the boutique vineyard, and the $50,000 embezzlement that funded my father's commercial debt. Catherine's word carries the weight of municipal law among the elite. She presented the truth not as a scandalous rumor, but as an unfortunate administrative reality. Within 48 hours, Caroline's digital smear campaign dissolved entirely, replaced by a cold, unified ostracization from the peers she had spent her life trying to impress. The social and financial consequences materialized rapidly. My parents received a polite, firmly worded letter from the Yacht Club's executive committee requesting their immediate resignation from all charity boards and planning committees. The letter cited a need for leadership transitioning, which is the preferred sanitized euphemism for social excommunication. Richard's beloved 40-foot sailing yacht was repossessed the same week. It was towed out of the harbor under the cover of early morning fog, but the absence was glaring. The visual of his empty boat slip served as a public, undeniable monument to his financial ruin. Victoria faced a much harsher reality. Preston canceled the lease on their luxury downtown apartment, severing all financial and emotional ties. Stripped of her wealthy fiancé and her golden child status, she had no choice but to pack her designer luggage and move back into our parents' financially sinking Colonial in Eastport. The house that had once served as the staging ground for their high society illusions was now a silent prison holding 3 people who had run out of lies. The curated perfection they had weaponized against me had collapsed into a suffocating shared failure. A lifetime of psychological conditioning does not evaporate overnight, even for someone who reads liability claims for a living. Despite my analytical nature, growing up as the designated scapegoat embeds a persistent, quiet instinct to absorb the blame for the family's misfortune. I sat on my apartment balcony a few weeks later, watching the harbor lights reflect off the dark water, and felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. I wondered if I should have handled the situation with more grace, if bringing the cream folder to the mediation was a step too far. I questioned whether I had engineered their downfall by refusing to yield the venue. Liam walked out onto the balcony carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. He handed one to me and sat down in the adjacent chair. He recognized the shift in my posture, understanding the specific burden of surviving a toxic household. He did not offer empty platitudes. He spoke with the steady, measured logic of an engineer assessing a load-bearing structure. He reminded me that I did not write the forged amendment note. I did not bounce the vineyard checks, and I certainly did not divert $50,000 away from a vendor to save a sinking business. He told me that boundaries only feel like attacks to people who are accustomed to trespassing without consequence. I had simply held up a mirror, forcing them to look at their own actions in a room full of witnesses. The resulting collapse was the natural consequence of their structural rot, not a product of my malice. His words recalibrated my perspective, anchoring me back to the reality of the paper trail and dispelling the lingering shadows of familial guilt. The transition toward the wedding day brought a profound sense of administrative and emotional peace. I contacted the vendors associated with both the June ceremony and the September welcome weekend to update my security protocols. Transparency is the best currency in event logistics. I arranged brief phone calls with the caterer, the florist, and the photographer, providing a sanitized but clear overview of the familial breach. I explained the necessity of the password protection, confirming that my sister and my parents held zero authority over the accounts and would not be present at the events. Instead of viewing me as a difficult client, the vendors rallied around me. They had already endured Victoria's erratic phone calls and demanding tone during her brief fraudulent tenure over the file. Relieved to be working directly with the honest sister, they offered exceptional service. The caterer voluntarily upgraded our raw bar selection, adding a premium tier of local oysters to the menu. The florist included an extra installation of white hydrangeas near the estate's main entrance, without charging an additional design fee. The environment surrounding the planning process transformed from a battlefield of conflicting egos into a collaborative, joyous endeavor. Professional respect replaced familial manipulation, proving that a calm, documented approach yields better results than entitlement and demands. The absence of my biological family created a temporary vacuum, but it was quickly filled by people who demonstrated actual, unshakable loyalty. I learned that true family is not defined by shared DNA or a common last name printed on a yacht club registry. It is defined by mutual respect, honesty, and the willingness to stand by your side when the truth becomes inconvenient. Liam's relatives embraced me, offering genuine support without requiring me to shrink myself to earn their approval. My colleagues from the insurance firm stepped in to help assemble welcome bags and organize seating charts, treating the upcoming celebration as a shared, hard-won victory. As the June 15th date approached, the anxiety that usually shadowed my interactions with my parents was replaced by a quiet, steady anticipation. I spent my weekends finalizing the logistics, reviewing the timelines, and enjoying the simple, profound peace of a life free from deception. I attended my final dress fitting, accompanied by Liam's mother and my closest friends. Looking at my reflection in the mirror, I did not miss Caroline's critical eye or Victoria's competitive remarks. I felt only gratitude for the silence they left behind. The Chesapeake Bay estate was ready. The contracts were secure. I had successfully defended my perimeter, dismantling a fraud scheme designed to consume my future. I was preparing to walk down the aisle into a life I had built with my own hands, surrounded by people who respected the boundaries I had set. The stage was perfectly arranged for the culmination of the summer celebration. However, the true reward of my strategic patience still awaited in the early weeks of autumn, where the final layer of my calculated maneuver would quietly unfold on the eastern shore. June the 15th arrived with the kind of perfect golden light that makes the Chesapeake Bay look like a painting. The heavy humidity that usually blankets Maryland in the early summer broke overnight, leaving the morning air crisp and entirely clear. I woke up in a hotel suite overlooking the harbor, surrounded by my bridesmaids and Liam's sister. The environment was devoid of tension. There was no frantic knocking on the door, no manufactured logistical crises, and no one demanding I alter my timeline to accommodate their fragile mood. The morning unfolded with a quiet, deliberate joy. The makeup artist worked without having to navigate my mother's passive complaints. I put on my silk gown, clasped a simple pearl necklace around my neck, and looked in the tall mirror standing in the corner of the room. I did not see a daughter who was expected to shrink herself to make room for her older sister. I saw a woman who had defended her perimeter and secured her own future. The ceremony took place on the sweeping back lawn of the Chesapeake Bay estate. The water stretched out directly behind the altar, catching the light and reflecting the bright afternoon sun. I walked down the long grassy aisle unaccompanied, holding a bouquet of white roses, my gaze fixed entirely on Liam, waiting at the front. His family occupied the first 3 rows on both sides, offering warm smiles and genuine support as I passed. The seating chart on my side of the aisle was carefully filled with colleagues, industry mentors, and lifelong friends who had proven their loyalty through consistent action rather than biological obligation. There were no empty chairs that mattered. The total absence of my parents and my sister did not feel like a tragic void in the crowd. It felt like a deep cleansing exhalation. We exchanged our vows under a beautiful wooden canopy draped with white hydrangeas, the exact flowers the florist had upgraded as a quiet gesture of professional solidarity. The words we spoke were promises built on honesty, a stark contrast to the transactional lies I had grown up hearing at my parents' dinner table. The reception was a masterclass in flawless hospitality execution. Without Caroline there to commandeer the social narrative, or Victoria there to critique the visual aesthetics, the entire evening flowed effortlessly. David, the senior director of events, personally oversaw the catering service, ensuring every detail aligned with my original contract. The raw bar, featuring local oysters, was exceptional. The signature cocktails were poured exactly to specification, and the jazz band played on the patio until the stars reflected clearly on the dark water. I danced with my new husband on the hardwood floor, surrounded by people who respected our boundaries and wholeheartedly celebrated our union. I looked around the grand mahogany ballroom, the exact room my family had tried to steal from me through forged amendments, and realized the truest victory was not just securing the venue. The truest victory was standing inside it without carrying the crushing weight of their expectations. The warm summer eventually gave way to a gentle September, bringing the ultimate payoff to my calculated administrative maneuver. While the June wedding was a formal, elegant affair, the autumn weekend on the Eastern Shore was designed for pure, unadulterated relaxation. Liam and I hosted a spectacular welcome party and a traditional Maryland clam bake at the Boutique Vineyard. It was the exact property Victoria had forfeited due to her own financial insolvency, the very same date she firmly believed she still owned, until the truth crushed her delusion. We set up long wooden tables between the turning grapevines, covering them with striped linen runners and galvanized buckets of iced local beer. The vineyard event manager, Claire, greeted us warmly upon arrival, ensuring every logistical detail was managed with precision. Our out-of-town guests arrived throughout the afternoon, marveling at the rustic wealth of the property and the sweeping, unobstructed views of the Maryland countryside. The contrast between our joyous celebration and the bleak reality my biological family was currently enduring could not have been more striking. While Liam and I toasted our new life together under the fading autumn sunset, my parents were navigating a suffocating self-inflicted exile. The forensic accountants deployed by Preston's family had meticulously audited Richard's commercial shipping accounts, uncovering years of fiscal mismanagement. The missing $50,000 was legally classified as wire fraud. To avoid criminal prosecution and total bankruptcy, my father was forced to liquidate the remainder of his tangible assets, selling the Eastport Colonial at a significant financial loss. The Annapolis Sailing Enclave had entirely erased Caroline and Richard from their exclusive social registry. They were ghosts in a town they used to rule, forced to rent a modest apartment far away from the coveted waterfront. Victoria, permanently stripped of her golden child status, and her wealthy fiancé was working a mundane clerical job to help pay their mounting legal fees. She was trapped in a grim reality she could no longer filter or forge. I stood near the edge of the vineyard property, holding a glass of white wine and watching the sunset cast long, dark shadows across the manicured grass. I realized in that quiet moment that toxic families view love strictly as a ledger. They constantly shift the numbers to favor the golden child, expecting the scapegoat to absorb the emotional and financial deficits without complaint. They operate under the arrogant assumption that familial obligation will always force you to surrender your assets, your peace, and your boundaries just to maintain their fragile facade. But paperwork does not lie, and dignity does not shout. You do not have to match an abuser's volume to win a dispute. You do not have to scream your defense in a crowded corporate lobby or post tearful manifestos online to validate your worth. The most effective defense against manipulation is a quiet, organized refusal to participate in the shared delusion. You simply have to know your inherent worth, carefully read the fine print on every agreement, and let the undeniable truth do the heavy lifting. I had watched my family build a towering fortress out of quicksand, relying entirely on my silence to keep the walls stable. When I finally stepped back and presented the structural reality of their deceit to the outside world, the entire architecture collapsed under its own hollow weight. I did not destroy their empire. I simply provided the documentation of their ruin to the people who held the power to hold them accountable. Liam walked over from the main patio and wrapped his arms around my shoulders, resting his chin gently against the top of my head. The evening air was rapidly cooling, carrying the sweet scent of crushed grapes mixed with the faint salty breeze from the distant bay. I leaned back into his warm embrace, feeling the solid, unshakable support of a partner who builds foundations rather than extracting resources. I looked out over the symmetrical rows of vines, stretching continuously toward the water, firmly rooted in my own hard-won peace. The ledger was finally closed, the debts were permanently settled, and the future belonged entirely to me. We often look at the curated lives of others, the manicured suburban lawns, the coordinated holiday portraits, the perfect American families smiling from the bow of a sailboat, and we instinctively assume that peace lives behind those polished front doors. But sometimes, the brightest facades cast the darkest and most enduring shadows. The story of Elizabeth and her family is far more than just a clash over a coveted wedding venue. It is a profound modern parable. It holds up a mirror to a deep, pervasive sickness in our society, a culture that increasingly worships outward optics while systematically starving the inner soul. For American parents navigating a hyper-competitive, image-driven world, this narrative serves as a stark warning. Yet more importantly, it offers a clear, illuminated path towards spiritual correction and genuine family responsibility. In the frantic pursuit of the American dream, it is remarkably easy to lose the plot. We are culturally conditioned to measure our worth by zip codes, country club memberships, and the perceived broadcasted success of our children. But as we saw in Elizabeth's family, parents who tie their ultimate value to these transient markers build their family foundations on sand. They lost everything, not because of a bad financial quarter, but because they were entirely consumed by the illusion of status. They valued their standing in the Annapolis Sailing Enclave far more than the truth of their own lives. True wisdom in parenting begins with recognizing the trap of material attachments. It is the understanding that you cannot manipulate the natural order of life, the deeply charted destiny of a soul, with forged documents, bounced checks, or forced appearances. A life built out of alignment with the truth will inevitably collapse under its own hollow weight. As parents, the mandate is clear. We must teach our children to value authenticity over aesthetics. A modest life lived in unwavering truth is infinitely more spiritually fulfilling than a luxurious life funded by deceit. If we raise our children to chase the spotlight, we leave them terrified of the dark. We must instead teach them how to tend to their own inner light. This brings us to the quiet, often unglamorous reality of family responsibility and morality. Morality in a traditional family structure is not defined by how generously you appear on a charity board, nor by the prestige of the galas you attend. It is defined by how you treat the souls entrusted to your care behind closed doors. Elizabeth's parents severely disrupted the spiritual and energetic balance of their home by shifting their resources to endlessly favor a golden child while attempting to cannibalize the hard-won assets of their other daughter. When parents project their own unhealed egos onto one child while treating another as mere overhead or an expendable resource, they incur a heavy karmic debt. It is a profound failure of emotional awareness and fairness. This toxic dynamic strips the golden child of their resilience, leaving them helpless and fragile when the real world demands accountability, just as Victoria was left adrift. Simultaneously, it forces the scapegoated child to survive in the cold, learning to build their own warmth from scratch. Integrity as a daily practice means doing what is right, especially when it is deeply inconvenient. Stealing from one child's future to fund another's illusion is the ultimate moral bankruptcy. Our children are not extensions of our egos. They are not public relations tools used to manage our social standing. They are independent spirits, and our highest moral duty is to nurture them equally fairly and with unflinching honesty. To raise children who can survive the complexities of the modern world, we must instill in them the sacred practice of boundaries. Perhaps the most powerful spiritual lesson in this entire narrative comes directly from Elizabeth herself. She embodies the highest, purest form of willpower. In our society, we frequently mistake aggression, screaming, and volume for strength. We are taught that the loudest voice in the room is the one in control. Elizabeth proves that true willpower is perfectly quiet. When faced with hysterical manipulation and severe emotional extortion, she did not match her family's toxic energy. She remained rooted in logic, facts, and profound stillness. Her willpower was not about controlling her parents. It was about demonstrating true mastery over herself. Setting boundaries is a sacred act of self-love and emotional awareness. Elizabeth's refusal to yield her wedding venue was not an act of petty revenge. It was a necessary defense of her own peace. As we guide the next generation, we must teach our children that they do not have to absorb the chaos of others. We must empower them to read the fine print of life, to know their inherent worth, and to stand immovable in their truth. We must show them that true dignity does not shout. Let us reflect on what it means to pass the torch to the next generation. The American family has always been a beacon of potential, a unit where values are meant to be forged and refined. But when we prioritize the packaging over the product, we fail our fundamental role as guides. Parenting is a long-term investment, not in financial portfolios, but in character. When a child learns that love is conditional, measured only by their ability to uphold a family lie, they are robbed of the emotional security necessary to thrive. We must ask ourselves what kind of legacy we are truly leaving behind. Are we leaving behind a trail of pristine photographs and hidden debts? Or are we leaving behind resilient, emotionally aware human beings who know how to navigate the storms of life with grace? If you have ever felt the quiet weight of setting a necessary boundary, or if you have ever watched a family ledger finally balance itself in the face of undeniable truth, you are not alone in this journey. We invite you to follow our channel QT Told Stories, where we continue to explore the quiet strength of ordinary people and the profound lessons hidden in the shadows of everyday life. Subscribe and join our community as we navigate the complex, often messy reality of holding the line. As the sun sets over the harbor, the water always eventually settles, turning back into a perfect glass-like mirror. It reflects whatever stands on the shore. When you look out over the calm waters of your own life and the ripples of your past choices begin to fade, what is the image that looks back at you? Is it the person you wanted the world to see, or the person your children always knew you to be? The tide is always shifting, and the horizon holds its secrets close.